Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, kick off your shoes, and maybe find that one specific pillow that actually supports your neck for once. Tonight, we're going to drift away into a world of absolute, soul-crushing bureaucracy. We are traveling to late Edo period Japan, not for the samurai duels or the flashy woodblock prints, but for something far more sedative, the administrative procedures for registering land titles. It's the kind of history that's so dry, it's practically a fire hazard, which makes it perfect for getting you to sleep. So, let's just float into the world of village headmen, ink-stained ledgers, and the endless, polite quest to prove that your rice paddy is in fact your rice paddy. The village headman and the infinite ledger. So, imagine you're a farmer in the 1840s, living just outside of Edo. You've got a nice little plot of land, some very ambitious radishes, and a sudden, overwhelming urge to make sure the government knows exactly where your fence ends. Because, of course, in the late Edo period, if it wasn't written down in 3 different books by a man wearing a very stiff silk vest, did the land even exist? Probably not. The center of your universe isn't the shogun in his big castle, it's the nanushi, or the village headman. He's essentially the human equivalent of a filing cabinet, but with more social anxiety. The nanushi was responsible for the kenchi-cho, which is the land inspection register. If your name wasn't in the kenchi-cho, you were basically a ghost living on a figment of your imagination. Every few decades, the local officials would decide it was time for a survey. Now, you'd think survey implies a quick stroll with a measuring tape, but this is 19th century Japan. It was a slow, methodical march of misery. Officials would arrive with long measuring poles called kenzao. They'd stand in your field, squinting at the sun, and argue about whether a step was a standard unit of measure, or if the surveyor's left leg was slightly shorter than his right. Because why have a simple system when you can have one based on the physical gait of a government employee? Once they measured your plot, they didn't just write down 1 acre. No, they had to categorize it. Was it superior land? Average land? Or wretched, why are we even standing here land? This classification determined your tax, or nengu, which was paid in rice. Naturally, every farmer spent the entire survey trying to convince the official that their lush, green field was actually a barren wasteland, incapable of growing a single weed. It was a delicate dance of strategic poverty. After the measurements were settled, usually after a lot of tea and very polite, very quiet sighing, the information was entered into the mizucho, the water register. This was the master document. It listed the location, the size, the quality, and the owner. But here's the kicker. The mizucho wasn't just a record, it was a sacred object. If the village office caught fire, the headman was expected to save the registers before he saved his own furniture. Because you can replace a table, but you can't replace 40 years of meticulously recorded radish tax. And if you wanted to sell that land? Oh friend, settle in. You couldn't just swap a bag of coins for a field. You needed a kuchigaki, a formal petition. You had to write to the headman explaining why you were selling. I'm old, my son is useless, or I've decided to become a hermit, were all valid reasons. Then, the headman had to check the gonengumi, the 5-household group system. Basically, your 4 closest neighbors had to sign off on your life choices. If they didn't like you, or if they thought the new buyer looked like a loud breather, they could nix the whole deal. It was peer pressure, elevated to a legal art form. The paperwork moved at the speed of a tired snail. Everything was hand-brushed on mulberry paper. If you made a mistake, you didn't just erase it. You had to cross it out and apply your hanko, your personal seal, to prove that you were the one who messed up. By the time a land title was officially transferred, the original buyer might have already aged out of wanting the land entirely. But at least the ledger was beautiful. Let's drift a bit further into the ink. The hanko headache and neighborly love okay. So we've established that the mizucho, the water register, was essentially the holy grail of late Edo land bureaucracy. But how did anything actually get into that register? It wasn't just a matter of the village headman nodding and dipping his brush. You couldn't just say you owned the land. You had to prove it, multiple times, and preferably with as much redundancy as humanly possible. This brings us to the beloved and utterly maddening world of Hanko. The Hanko is your personal seal, your stamp, the unique identifier of your bureaucratic existence. Forget signatures. They were messy, subjective, and prone to looking like a child had attacked the paper. A stamp, however, was uniform, reproducible, and, crucially, very difficult to argue with. In Edo, Japan, you didn't just have one Hanko. That would be too simple. A respectable farmer might have several, each registered for a different level of transaction. But the most important one for land was the jitsuan, the registered seal. When you wanted to transfer land, or even just update the quality classification, maybe that barren wasteland was finally growing a decent turnip, you needed your jitsuan. You'd bring it to the village office, where the nanushi, biroren, would compare it against the inkanbo, the official ledger of registered seals. He would peer at your stamp, then peer at the register, then peer back at your stamp. It was like a medieval eye exam, but with much higher stakes. If the ink was slightly too thick, or if you stamped it slightly off-center, you were looking at a long discussion about the metaphysical implications of symmetry. But even a perfect stamp wasn't enough. The central government, the shogunate, was deeply suspicious that people were, being people. They were convinced everyone was trying to cheat on their land taxes, which they were, but that's beside the point. So, they layered on additional levels of verification. You needed witnesses, but not just any witnesses. You needed witnesses who were legally and financially tied to your success. This brings us to the Gonengumi system, the 5 household groups. This was, frankly, a stroke of bureaucratic genius, if your definition of genius includes creating a panopticon out of your neighbors. Every household in the village was grouped into a cluster of 5. These groups were collectively responsible for everything. Taxes? Collective. Policing? Collective. Following the shogunate's random edicts about appropriate hairstyles? Definitely collective. If one person screwed up, all 5 got the blame. So, let's say you, Tanaka-san, are selling a tiny rice paddy. You've argued with the surveyor, got your Hanko ready, and written your Kuchigaki petition. Great. Now you need the signature, or rather, the stamp, of the other 4 heads of household in your Gonengumi. If neighbor Kimura thinks you are selling the land too cheap and it will lower his property value, even though there isn't really a property value in the modern sense, he could refuse to stamp it. If neighbor Sato is mad that your cow looked at him funny 3 years ago, he could refuse. The Gonengumi had a vested interest in your business because your financial stability was their financial stability. If you couldn't pay your share of the village tax, they had to cover it. It was like a very, very small, very intense homeowners association, but without the power to fine you for having the wrong color mailbox. So, the process wasn't just administrative, it was deeply political within the village. You didn't just need the headman to approve, you had to maintain good standing with 4 families who held your bureaucratic fate in their hands. The paperwork wasn't just mulberry paper and ink. It was woven into the social fabric of the entire community. It was designed to move slowly, deliberately, and with the kind of crushing consensus that ensures everyone is equally miserable, or at least, equally compliant. The papers had to be stamped, and then verified, and then cross-stamped, and then, finally, the nanushi could dip his brush and update them. It was a system that valued precision, repetition, and above all, the status quo. Change was dangerous. New owners were a risk. So the process, in its infinite rhythmic dullness, served to slow everything down, allowing time to make sure that the radical act of selling a radish patch didn't accidentally overthrow the social order. Let's sink deeper into the paperwork. The measuring sticks and the great soil debate. So, we've handled the neighbors, and we've survived the stamp polishing phase. Now we get to the part of the late Edo period that truly deserves a gold medal in the Olympics of boredom, the Kenchi, or the actual land survey. This wasn't just a guy with a clipboard. This was a theatrical production of measurements that could last weeks. Mostly because everyone involved had a different definition of how big a field actually was. In the late Edo period, the shogunate was obsessed with productivity. They didn't care about how many square feet you had. They cared about how much rice that dirt could cough up. This meant the survey team, usually a mix of local village officials and a few stony-faced representatives from the regional magistrate, didn't just bring measuring tools. They brought an intense amount of judgment. The primary tool was the kenzao, a measuring pole usually about 6 shaku long, roughly 6 feet, give or take an inch depending on which official's ego was involved that day. They would lay these poles end to end across your muddy field. Imagine watching 2 grown men in silk robes slowly, methodically flipping wooden sticks across a swampy rice paddy for 6 hours. It was the 19th century equivalent of watching paint dry, but with more mosquitoes and much higher taxes. Once they had the dimensions, they didn't just multiply length by width and call it a day. That would be far too efficient. They had to determine the kokudaka, the estimated yield. This is where the great soil debate began. Every single plot of land was shoved into one of 4 categories: joden, chuden, gedden, and the delightfully named gegoden, which essentially meant, this is basically a rock, why are we here? Naturally, the farmer's goal was to convince the surveyors that their land was a biological disaster. You'd see farmers pointing at a perfectly healthy stalk of rice and sighing deeply, claiming it was a miracle it hadn't withered away yet. They'd highlight every pebble, every slightly salty patch of dirt, and every shadow cast by a nearby tree. Oh, this field? It's gegoden at best, sir. I'm practically farming on a gravel pit. The surveyors, who had seen this performance 1,000 times, would just blink, adjust their hats, and mark it down as superior anyway. Because, of course, the government needed its cut. All of this data was then meticulously transcribed into the Kenchi-cho. But here's the most soothing part, the math. The units of measurement were a nested doll of confusion. You had bu, sei, tan, and cho. Our 30 bu made 1 sei. A 10 sei made 1 tan. A 10 tan made 1 cho. If you were a farmer trying to do the math in your head while standing in the rain, you probably just gave up and accepted whatever the man with the brush wrote down. The Kenchi-cho would list the name of the plot you off in something charming like the field behind the big rock, or the slightly damp corner, followed by its dimensions in these units, and finally its assessed value in koku of rice. And if the field was irregular, if it wasn't a perfect rectangle, oh, the joy! The surveyors had to break the field down into tiny triangles and trapezoids, measuring each one individually and adding them up. It was a geometry final exam that lasted for days, conducted in the middle of a field, recorded with brushes that would smudge if a single raindrop hit the paper. The level of detail was staggering. They recorded the irrigation ditches. They recorded the narrow paths between fields. They recorded the single persimmon tree in the corner that produced maybe 3 edible fruits a year. Everything was accounted for, categorized, and filed away in the village archives, ensuring that for the next 20 years, everyone knew exactly how much of a superior or wretched life you were leading. It was a slow, rhythmic process of quantification, a way of turning the messy, organic reality of nature into a neat, ink-stained grid. And as the sun set over the paddies, the only sound was the scratching of the brush and the soft thud-thud of the measuring poles moving on to the next unlucky farmer's plot. Let's drift further into the archives. Part 4. The succession scuffles and the dead man stampso. We've measured the dirt. We've argued over the quality of the radishes, and we've made sure the neighbors aren't holding a grudge. But then, life happens. Or rather, the end of it. In the late Edo period, dying was, predictably, a massive administrative inconvenience. Because when a landholder passed away, the land didn't just automatically go to his eldest son. That would be far too efficient, and efficiency was practically a sin in the shogunal bureaucracy. When a head of household died, the land title entered a sort of legal purgatory. It was called goningumi-sho, or the transition of authority within the 5-household group. The first thing that had to happen wasn't a funeral, it was an audit. The village headman had to verify that the deceased hadn't secretly sold off a corner of the slightly damp field to pay off a gambling debt or a particularly expensive tea habit. The heir, usually the eldest son, had to submit a sozoku nagai, a formal petition for succession. Now, you'd think being the son was enough proof, but the shogunate loved a good paper trail. You had to prove you were who you said you were, using the Shumanarame-ko, the religious census register. This book tracked every person's temple affiliation, basically making sure you weren't a secret Christian and that you actually belonged to the family you claimed to. If the heir was, say, a bit of a black sheep, maybe he liked the pleasure districts of Edo a bit too much, or perhaps he was just remarkably bad at growing rice, the Gonengumi neighbors could actually voice their concerns. If they thought the son would bankrupt the farm and leave them holding the bag for the village taxes, they could make the succession process a living nightmare. They might lose their stamps for a few weeks, or conveniently forget to attend the verification meeting at the headman's house. And what if there was no son? Well, then we enter the wonderful, sleepy world of Yoshiengumi, the adult adoption. To keep the land title within the house, the I, a family would adopt a son-in-law or a distant cousin. This required even more paperwork. The adopted son had to legally die in his old family's register and be born into the new one. It was a bureaucratic reincarnation. The headman had to scratch out one name and brush in another, while everyone watched to make sure the ink didn't blot. Sometimes a landholder would die suddenly without a clear heir, leading to what was known as angoya, hidden or dark succession. This usually involved the family frantically trying to find a distant relative before the regional magistrate noticed the vacancy and reclaimed the land for the shogunate. There are stories of families propping up a deceased patriarch behind a screen, pretending he was just a bit under the weather, while they rushed the adoption paperwork through the village office. It was a very slow, very quiet version of a weekend at Bernie's, but with more green tea and fewer tropical shirts. Once the heir was finally approved, he had to get a new hanko and register it. The old seal of the father was officially retired, often kept in a small wooden box as a reminder of the man who spent 40 years arguing about the Kenzao poles. The new owner would then take his place in the Kenchi-cho, the ink barely dry on his new title, and the cycle of taxes, measurements, and polite neighborly spying would begin all over again. It was a system designed for stability, which is just a fancy way of saying it was designed to make sure nothing ever changed. Every death was a potential crisis for the village's tax quota, so every succession was treated with the gravity of a royal coronation, even if it was just for a patch of mud that grew particularly stubborn carrots. The brush scratches on, the paper ages to a soft yellow, and the land stays exactly where it was, indifferent to the names written next to it. The phantom fields and the art of hiding dirt. So, we've talked about the official ledgers and the village headman's constant hovering. But you have to imagine that, after a few generations of paying taxes in rice, literally handing over a huge chunk of your dinner to a guy in a fancy vest, some farmers started getting creative. This brings us to the sleepy, somewhat scandalous world of Kanden, or hidden fields. Now, hiding a field sounds like a magic trick, doesn't it? You can't exactly fold up a rice paddy and put it under your futon. But in the late Edo period, hiding land was less about physical concealment and more about bureaucratic camouflage. It was the 19th century version of tax evasion, performed with extreme politeness and a lot of strategically placed bushes. A farmer might clear a small patch of forest on the edge of his property land that wasn't on the official Kenchi-cho map. He'd plant some extra crops there, maybe some beans or a little more rice, and just forget to mention it to the nanushi. If the village headman was a cousin or a particularly chill neighbor, he might look the other way, especially since he didn't want the village's total tax quota to go up either. It was a community effort in not seeing things. However, the shogunate wasn't entirely oblivious. Every so often, a regional magistrate Yadaikan would get a sudden burst of energy and order This was the ultimate buzzkill for the village. The officials would arrive with their measuring poles, looking for any suspiciously green patches that weren't in the books. Farmers would go to great lengths to make these phantom fields look like something else. They'd plant tall weeds around the edges, or claim the land was sacred ground for a tiny weathered shrine that had definitely been there for centuries, even if the wood was suspiciously fresh. If a surveyor spotted a patch of unauthorized radishes, the farmer might shrug and say, "Oh, those are wild radishes. They just grew there out of spite. They're terrible, really. You wouldn't want to tax those." The consequences of getting caught well, they weren't exactly a slap on the wrist. You'd be hit with back taxes, a heavy fine, and a very awkward conversation with your Ganangumi neighbors, who were now also in trouble because they were supposed to be watching you. The shame alone was enough to make a person want to vanish. But for many, the risk was worth it. Those few extra bushels of rice meant the difference between a comfortable winter and a very hungry one. So, the game of cat and mouse continued. The surveyors would measure, the farmers would deflect, and the Nanushi would sit in his office, slowly dipping his brush and wondering if he should mention the new orchard he saw behind the temple last Tuesday. It was a slow-motion rebellion. No one was storming the castle. They were just quietly planting beans where they weren't supposed to. It was a history of survival written in the margins of the official record, a testament to the fact that no matter how many stamps and registers you have, people will always find a way to keep a little bit of the earth for themselves. The paperwork might be absolute, but the land has a way of being complicated. The paperwork of disasters, when the land moves so. We've talked about people trying to hide the land, but what happened when the land decided to hide itself? In late Edo Japan, nature was, to put it mildly, uncooperative. You had earthquakes, the occasional volcanic tantrum from Mount Fuji, and most frequently, the rivers. The rivers loved to move. You'd go to sleep with a lovely riverside view and wake up to find your rice paddy was now a permanent part of the riverbed. This was known as kawayoke, or river encroachment, and it was a bureaucratic nightmare of the highest order. When a flood washed away your field, you didn't just mourn your lost crops, you had to start a paper trail. You had to file a petition for kenshutsu, an inspection of the damage, because naturally, the shogunate didn't just take your word for it that your land was now at the bottom of a lake. They suspected you were just trying to get a tax break. So, the Nanushi and a regional official would have to trudge out to the muddy remains of your life, stand on the bank, and peer into the water. If they confirmed the land was gone, they'd issue a Gomen Shonga tax exemption. But here's the soothing, repetitive catch-nuss: you had to reapply for this exemption every single year. The government operated on the optimistic, yet exhausting, assumption that the land might just spontaneously reappear. Is it still underwater, Tanaka-san? Yes, sir. It's been a lake for 3 years. Well, we'll check again next autumn. Stamp here, please. And then there was the opposite problem, Shinden Kaihatsu, or new field development. Sometimes a flood would deposit a huge sandbank that eventually became fertile soil. Suddenly, you had new land. You'd think this was a win, but it triggered a cascade of administrative chores. You had to register the new land, but for the first few years, it was often granted a kenko, a temporary tax-free status, while you cleared the rocks and debris. The paperwork for these disaster titles was kept in a separate, often slightly damp-smelling ledger. It was a record of the Earth's instability. Every entry was a story of a family trying to stay afloat, literally and financially, while the government insisted on measuring the air where a field used to be. It was a slow, rhythmic dance between the permanence of the ink and the impermanence of the world. The officials would brush their characters onto the mulberry paper, documenting the shifting silt, while the farmers watched the clouds and prayed for a boring, dry year. Because in the late Edo period, interesting weather meant interesting paperwork, and nobody wanted that. The ink dries, the river flows, and the Nanushi reaches for a fresh sheet of paper. The great ledger audits, the inspector's cold stare. So, we've made it through the floods and the phantom fields, but now we arrive at the final boss of late Edo bureaucracy, the Kanzatsu, or the official audit. Every few decades, the shogunate would decide that the village headmen were getting a little too relaxed. Perhaps too many wild radishes were appearing in the margins. So, they would send an inspector from the central government, a man whose entire personality was likely composed of dried seaweed and rigid moral superiority. When the inspector arrived, the village didn't throw a party. They threw a fit of organized panic. The nanushi would spend weeks in his office, stay up by candlelight, and pray that the silverfish hadn't eaten the bottom corner of the 1822 Mizucho. Because if a single stamp was missing, or if a plot of land had migrated 10 feet to the left since the last survey, the inspector would have questions. And in late Edo Japan, you didn't want to have to answer questions from a man who traveled with a small army of scribes. The audit was a slow-motion interrogation of paper. The inspector would sit on a raised mat, and the village headman would kneel before him, presenting the ledgers like they were holy relics. They would go through them page by page. Thump. The ledger hits the floor. Flip. A page turns. Squint. The inspector leans in to examine a smudge that might be a thumbprint or might be a signature from a deceased great-uncle. The inspector was looking for leakage. That was the official term for land that wasn't being taxed properly. He'd compare the village's internal records with the shogunate's master copies back in Edo. If the numbers didn't match, if, say, the village claimed to have 100 tan of land, but the inspector's map suggested 105, the atmosphere in the room would turn colder than a mountain stream in February. The headman would then have to provide a reason for discrepancy. This was an art form in itself. Oh, that extra 5 tan? That's actually a very large, very flat rock that we accidentally painted green. Or, the river moved, then moved back, but it did so very quietly, so we didn't want to bother you with the paperwork. The inspector would just stare, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference, before ordering a corrective entry. A corrective entry meant more stamps. It meant the Gonengumi had to be summoned to verify the newly discovered land. It meant the farmer who had been quietly growing tea on that hillside for 20 years suddenly had a very large tax bill and a very disappointed neighbor. The audit was the shogunate's way of reminding everyone that the paper was the reality and the dirt was just a suggestion. But eventually, even the most dedicated inspector would get tired. The sun would set, the ink would run low, and the sheer crushing weight of thousands of pages of land titles would wear him down. He'd sign off on the village's improved accuracy, take his entourage, and move on to the next village to repeat the process. The nanushi would finally breathe, put the ledgers back in their fireproof boxes, and perhaps treat himself to a very small, very quiet cup of sake. The status quo had been restored. The paperwork was balanced. The world was, once again, perfectly, boringly organized. The ink settles. The village sleeps. And the land? Well, the land just waits for the next surveyor's pole. The end of the brush, the Meiji sunset. So, we've spent quite a long time, centuries, really, floating through the world of mulberry paper and village headmen. But eventually, even the most stubborn bureaucracy has to meet the horizon. As we reach the 1860s and 70s, the world of the late Edo period begins to dissolve. The shogunate, with all its measuring poles and 5 household groups, is replaced by the Meiji government. And if you thought the Edo period loved paperwork, the Meiji officials were on an entirely different level. They didn't just want to record the land, they wanted to own the data. This leads us to the Chigakaisei, the land tax reform of 1873. It was the ultimate administrative reset button. The new government looked at the thousands of hand-brushed Mizucho ledgers and decided they were far too charming and far too inefficient. They wanted maps that actually matched the ground. They wanted a system where land was owned by individuals, not by houses or villages. Imagine the scene. A new breed of official arrives in the village. He's not wearing a silk vest. He's wearing a Western-style suit that's a bit too tight in the shoulders. He's carrying a brass theodolite instead of a wooden pole. He doesn't want to hear about wild radishes or the field behind the big rock. He wants a number, a precise decimal-pointed number. The old nanushi, the village headman, who knew every family's history and every hidden patch of beans, suddenly found his brushstroke wisdom obsolete. The government issued chaikin, or land title certificates. These were printed, not handwritten. They had fancy borders and official stamps that looked like they belonged on a banknote. For the first time, land was a commodity that could be bought, sold, and mortgaged without asking your 4 nearest neighbors for permission. The transition was, predictably, a quiet catastrophe of paperwork. Millions of tiny plots had to be remeasured. Old disputes that had been settled with a polite sigh 40 years ago were reopened in modern courts. The phantom fields were finally dragged into the light of the tax office. It was the end of the great paperwork sleep, and the beginning of a very loud, very modern headache. But as the old ledgers were tucked away into the deep recesses of local archives, the rhythm of the land didn't really change. The seasons still turned, the rice still grew, and the mud remained mud. The only difference was that the ink was now modern, the paper was industrial, and the slightly damp corner was now officially known as Plot 402B. And so, we leave the late Edo period behind. We leave the scratching brushes, the tired surveyors, and the village headman squinting at a thumbprint. The ledgers are closed. The ink is dry. The bureaucracy has finally found its rest. Close your eyes now. Imagine the soft rustle of those old mulberry pages one last time before the archive door clicks shut. Sleep well.